Perhaps the most intimidating factor about going into investment banking is the sheer amount of hours that you're rumored to have to do on the job. Of course, it's a lucrative and interesting job, but even the most intense finance people wonder in the back of their minds if they can really handle the hours. Honestly, the transaction-oriented nature of doing deals just requires a certain amount of work. There's not really a way around it. Even the simplest transactions require analysis on both sides, lots of negotiations, and lots of discussion. I do still think that the hours get overblown a little bit in investment banking. So today I'm going to share with you the distribution of hours you can expect to work in investment banking on a particular week. I'll also go over the key reasons that make investment banking as grindy as it is. So I want to lead off with what I think is a realistic range. I honestly think that if you are at a bulge bracket or elite boutique, most of your work weeks are going to be between 60 and 80 hours. And honestly, that's kind of just the truth. If you want to be in a competitive group and you want good recruiting opportunities, there's just a certain standard you're going to have to cross. But I think understanding investment banking hours requires a little bit more specificity because the nature of investment banking is very lumpy. And being deal oriented means that your life is going to change from week to week. Some weeks you'll be on a very live transaction in the middle of it, sprinting towards the close, and other weeks you'll just be pitching or preparing for conferences or preparing for less urgent meetings. So I would say that 80% of the time, your hours are going to fall between the 60 and 80 hour range. On the far right, the extreme is 100 hours. I honestly think that this represents a pretty small portion of time. Some people will say that they average 100 hours. I personally don't believe it over a prolonged period of time. There's a limit to the human psyche and what people can withstand, and I don't know anyone who averaged 100 hours throughout the duration of their investment banking career. On the other end of the spectrum, I do think you can get to this 40 to 50 hour range. For example, there's a couple of weeks in August that tend to slow down a little bit because everyone goes on vacation. There's also the weeks around Christmas and Thanksgiving, which typically are a little bit quieter. I want to stress that although the graph makes 60 and 80 hours look similar, they're actually very different when you experience them. So in my opinion, this is what a 60-hour work week really looks like. At a minimum, you're going to be working 12 hours a day between Monday and Thursday. That means if you get in around 9 or 10, you're leaving at around 9 or 10. I would say that Fridays are always going to be a little bit better. A lot of firms, even if they grind super hard, try to allow people to enjoy their Friday evenings. But that generally means you have to work a couple of hours on the weekend. If you're on something kind of important or you need to move the ball forward, it's hard to have 2 days where no one has touched any work. In general though, this 60 hours, it's survivable. I wouldn't say it's good, but a lot of careers, even outside of finance, have to deal with 60 hours. But you can still have a social life, you can still see people on the weekends, you can still work out a couple times a week. It's reasonable. At 60 hours, you generally still have 1 day off per week, which I think makes a huge difference as it relates to your mental health. So this is the 80-hour week. And this, I think, represents what you would get during a typical deal mode. This generally means you're working about 14 hours every single day between Monday and Thursday. That means you're getting off after midnight. That means you have very little free time, if any, during the week. I always found it interesting, but I feel like even in the super grindy periods, I still always needed like 30 minutes to myself every day or an hour every day in order to survive, even if it was coming directly out of my sleep. The problem with the 80-hour week is you're working a lot on the weekends. You don't really have a single day off. In general, during a deal, I found that I was working the entire afternoon on Saturday and most of the day on Sunday. I think you can generally still do something on Friday night miraculously, but I would say overall 80 hours is really where you find your physique to start to deteriorate, your mental health, and your happiness to start to just erode slowly over time. The most common follow-up question typically is, why do investment bankers have to work so much? Is it purely inefficiency? Why can't they just add more analysts if they have to work so much? It took me a while to appreciate the nuances, but in order to understand it, I think you need to understand how the investment bank work product comes together. When you're putting together materials or analysis in investment banking, I would say there are 3 external factors that will impact how much work you have to do. The first is the market. So if you're dealing with public companies, every time there's a big price movement, or if just the passage of time occurs, you'll have to painstakingly go through all the analysis, make sure that it ties with one another, make sure that the date is coordinated across all the pages. And because investment banking is primarily done in Excel, this is all done manually, and it takes a lot of time. And if it's a competitive process, if you're banking a client in a sell side and bidders are submitting new information, you might have to update it as well. The next factor is the client, because investment banking is sell side work. You are servicing a client. If you have a demanding client, or maybe your client is in a different time zone, or your client used to work in finance, so they feel like they need to show you who's boss, these are all factors that can just make your job more difficult. Thirdly, I would say is deal complexity. If you're working on a really challenging deal, if they have a very unusual capital structure, or if it's a unique transaction, or if there's many different advisors and different work streams, that can also make the amount of hours you have increase. But that's not all. I think internally, the main factor that's really impacting this is going to be the culture as well as the proficiency of the team. And the thing is that every time an external factor changes, you're going to have to change the work product. You're going to have to update it. You're going to have to go through the analysis. And that leads through iterations and iterations. And depending on the culture of your team, if it's very hierarchical, you'll have to do more iterations. If it's not very proficient, or if people don't really know finance concepts that well, you're going to have to do more and more iterations. So if you are working on a public deal that is very complex and your team isn't very efficient, there's almost no way around it. You're going to be working at least 80 hours. So here are some observations from my own work experience. The difference between 60 and 80 hours might not seem super intense on paper, but every additional 5 hours per week is pretty painful, and it's exponentially painful. The difference between 60 and 65 is nothing compared to the difference between 95 and 100. At a certain point, at about 70 or 80 hours, every additional hour you work is coming directly out of your sleep. I would say that you can typically expect about 10 to 15% of your time to be downtime, which could potentially be FaceTime, when you're kind of just waiting for other products or deliverables to arrive, or you're waiting to hear back from your client. So in conclusion, I think if you are going to work for a large investment bank, you're most likely going to work between 60 and 80 hours on average. I would say the vast majority of people at some point have second guesses about the intensity that they're exposing themselves to. I honestly think that if you're a committed college student, if you have a good support system, and you view yourself as a particularly ambitious person, you will get through this. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.